The Akizuki and Shimakaze class destroyers are both meant to be upgrades, or successors to the Yugumo and/or Kagero class destroyers as escorts to the main fleets of the Imperial Japanese Navy. Now, they were vastly different. The Shimakaze class was like a super Kagero class or a super Yugumo class, where it was the same armament. It was the same six 5-inch guns and a bunch of fucking torpedoes, plus a supercharged engine. But the Akizuki went in a completely different direction. By all means, it was a weaker ship. It was slower. It had smaller guns. It had more guns, but it had smaller guns. 100mm guns as opposed to 127. And had less torpedoes. The torpedoes being the main sort of punch that the Japanese destroyers had. It was the long lance. The fact that it had less of them was a complete sort of just a detour from old school Japanese doctrine. Now, of course, everyone knows that old school Japanese doctrine wasn't that great, so I suppose that was an improvement. But was it? So the new guns, there were more of them. They were smaller. In fact, according to NavWeps, the bursting charge, like the actual explosive fit, or like part that was boom, and the shells were about half the weight, half the size, meaning that even though the reduction in diameter of the shells themselves was less than 30 millimeters, that cut the bursting charge in half, which meant that it has less killing power if it hits an enemy ship, and if it hits a plane, it, again, has less killing power. Combined with the fact that it got rid of half the torpedoes from the previous Yugumo class, it would seem that the Akizuki class was a huge departure and a huge downgrade from the previous classes. It would seem that it was a stopgap measure or some sort of escort ship, and not a full-fledged destroyer. Now, the fact of the matter is that it was actually more an adaptation to the changing realities of the role of the destroyer. You can look, at modern navies, you see that destroyers, even now, have a 5-inch armament, so that seems to be like the sort of prime Goldilocks zone for a destroyer. And of course, you can't ignore the fact that the destroyer has changed roles a lot in the past 70 years, so they're not really that comparable. And in fact, the 100mm Type 98 was actually the best destroyer weapon that the Japanese had in the 40s. Despite the greater killing power of the long lance and the greater killing power and range and explosive filler of the 5-inch shell, the 100mm gun was actually a better destroyer gun. Not a better gun overall, but a better destroyer gun. And that's because the role of the destroyer, as envisioned by the Japanese before the Second World War, was to harass enemy capital ships. They became the torpedo boats that they were meant to destroy. But that, in the end, wasn't what they were being used for. In the end, they were being used to escort. They were being used to protect carriers and protect battleships and protect heavy cruisers, actual capital ships, and not against other destroyers, and not against torpedo boats, but mostly against aircraft. And when aircraft are into play, what's more important is how many bullets can you put up in the air at once. It doesn't matter if your shells are 460mm across if you can't hit shit with them. So it's more important to put up a bunch of individual smaller bullets, which means that by all means, the Shimakaze class is a better ship. It's a better individual ship, right? If it was a contest against a single Shimakaze class versus a single Akizuki class, the Shimakaze wins like 92% of the time. But as a destroyer, as an escort ship, as an all-around, what is easier to produce and what works better in the actual role that a destroyer is meant to have, right, in the 40s, and in the mid-40s, the Akizuki class wins every single time. It's got more guns, 8 versus 6 barrels, and who gives a shit about the torpedoes, right? Now, it's true that at Tasafaranga, the decisive weapon was torpedoes, but that was not what destroyers were meant to be used for. In fact, the whole thing happened because they were being used to fucking as supply ships, which is retarded overall, and that their main role as escorts is better served by having a larger number of high-velocity, high-altitude guns. Also because of the fact that the 5-inch guns were trash as dual-purpose guns because of the way they were reloaded. You had to put in not just the shell, the bullet itself, but also a separate bag for the gunpowder, which meant that you had to bring the barrels down from looking up to looking sideways. And that takes time to move those barrels, meaning that in that time, the enemy aircraft is gonna fucking come and, drop a torpedo at you and you're gonna die. Versus the 100mm gun, which of course had self-contained shells, meaning that they could be reloaded at a high angle, and so they could keep up their high rate of fire and throw more lead at approaching planes. What all this means is that even though the Shimakaze class was a better individual ship, a better technical feat, it was faster, better guns, more torpedoes, and had more killing power as a ship against ships, that's not what the role of destroyers was in the mid to late 40s. Their role was as protectors, as escorts, to defend capital ships and high-value targets against the main threat of the war, which wasn't cruisers, it wasn't battleships, it wasn't submarines, well, it was not submarines, but more importantly against ships, it was carrier aircraft. And the 100mm gun was a much, much, much better weapon in that respect. It's true that at Tassafaranga,